So just a quick overview of risk management. And where do we start from? We start by, you know, creating a risk management plan. Now, the goal of the risk management plan is to help you identify, analyze, and respond to risk on your project. That's the summary. It has a number of components, but the goal is to help you to identify. How do we identify? We use risk categories. How do we analyze? We use the probability and impact rating matrix. And how do we respond? We use roles and responsibilities, and we come up with risk responses. So the risk management plan gives us the outline of how we're going to do all that. Then going to the next process, we talked about how to identify risk. Now, risk identification can be done in a group of stakeholders, your team members, and anybody that has experience in that area of the project. And you can do risk identification by brainstorming, just asking yourselves, what are the kind of risks that can happen? Now, let me give you an example. So when I was managing the, what do you call it, project for, what do you call it, World Remit, right? It happened right after, it happened a few months after NSAS, and we were doing risk identification, and one of the risks I identified, of course, was, is it possible that if we're having any youth engagement program that police can maybe try to disrupt? Now, that's an example of risk identification. Now, it depends on your project. It depends on your team, how knowledgeable and how experienced. Usually, the more experienced your team members are, the better you can identify risk. So you can brainstorm, you can interview, you can use a SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strength, weakness, opportunities, threat. You do a SWOT analysis, opportunities and threats are positive and negative risk. And then you can use a prompt list like PESTLE analysis. Now, when we talk about PESTLE, PESTLE is an acronym for political, economical, social-cultural, technological, legal, and environmental. But you can also use PESTLE as risk categories. That's where it becomes a prompt list, where you're asking, what are the political risks on my project? What are the economic risks? For example, if your project is based on USD and you're in Nigeria, economic risk could be fluctuations in exchange rate. So you use different methods to identify risk. And when you identify the risk, you create that risk register, which I posted on the class group, right? And you create the risk register, identify all the risk, and identify the triggers. The triggers are those things that indicate that a risk will happen soon. And move on to the next process, which is qualitative risk analysis. And the focus of qualitative risk analysis is to assess the probability and impact of every risk in your probability and impact assessment of every risk in your project, and then use a probability and impact matrix to rank the risk as high, medium, and low. So qualitative risk analysis helps us to rank our risk. And this is what the probability and impact rating matrix, which means once you've identified the risk, then you rank it high, medium, low. Now, the reason you need to rank risk is because you need to prioritize. Everything can be a risk. Do you know that? What now? Have you heard of people who were taking their bath, they slipped, hit their head, and died? Right? It's a risk. So taking your bath can also be a risk. But you see, we don't want to just generalize everything as a risk. So that's why we need to rank. And how do we rank? We use probability and impact to rank the risk. We use probability and impact. So based on the probability and impact assessment, we use this matrix to determine the rank. So let me give an example. If you have, and I spoke about this, so please, this doesn't mean you shouldn't watch yesterday's video. This is just a brief summary so that you don't feel that you've lost so much. So if you look at probability and impact, let's say I have a risk, the probabilities of it occurring is 0.9, and the impact, if it should happen, is 0.9, it will fall here. And any risk that falls in this purple shaded region is high ranking risk. So it is actually the probability and impact of the risk that determines whether it's going to be high, medium, or low. And you need to rank those risks because it will determine how you respond to the risk. And then we now move on to quantitative risk analysis. And the focus of quantitative risk analysis and where most questions come from is in the decision tree analysis. So they'll most likely give you a diagram like this. And it's a very simple, it follows simple calculations. Basically, what happens is per project, you multiply probability and impact. But there's also another rule that the sum of the probability of all the risk in your project should equal 1. And the reason why it should equal 1 is that it means that if all the risk in your project equal 1, it means that you've captured every single thing that can happen. If it's not equal to 1, it means there's a risk that is potential to happen in your project, but you've not captured it, and you haven't captured this impact. And when you're doing decision tree analysis, you multiply probability and impact of each risk, which is called risk exposure, and then add them up to get the expected monetary value. And then in decision tree analysis, we choose the project that has the higher expected monetary value. You can see they did this with project B, where the probability multiplied by the impact for the two risks. And notice that the probability is equal to 1, 0.5 plus 0.5 is equal to 1. Multiplying probability and impact gives us a risk exposure of this risk and this. When you add it, you get 8,750. So we choose project A, which is 9,250 over B, and that's how you analyze the decision tree analysis. So they can ask you that maybe the government is thinking about which train station they should build. Should they build a new train station in New York or New Jersey? And they'll give you two options. And at the end of the day, they might even use a decision tree analysis to show you the negative impact of those two train stations, and then they'll ask you which should the government go for. So they use a practical application of decision tree analysis, but it's just simple. If you go through the way I did it in class, and it's just here, you can answer any decision tree analysis question. Then we now talked about risk response planning. Now, you have to remember all the different types of risk response. Share, exploit, enhance are for positive risk. Avoid, transfer, mitigate are for negative risk. Then we have contingency risk response, and we also have acceptance. Acceptance is a risk response strategy where you don't have any choice, but you just have to accept the risk. So, for example, one of the risks you indicated is exchange rate fluctuations, and then it happens in your project that the exchange rate has gone beyond what you even expected. Now, instead of stopping a project, acceptance means you're going to continue the project irrespective of whatever exchange rate. That means you've accepted the risk. That's what acceptance. There are some risks that when they happen, we don't have any response but just to accept the risk, right? If we could reduce the impact of the risk, then it's more of a mitigation. If we can send the risk to a third party or use insurance to cover the negative impacts, then it's a transfer. If we can change our plan so that the risk can be, so that we don't face the risk, then it's an avoid. I explained all this in risk response planning yesterday. Then implement risk response is what we simply do when a risk happens, and then you go to your risk response, your risk register, look at the risk response you've selected for that risk, right? And then execute it. That's all this is all about. Implementing risk response is because you've already planned, you've already anticipated all the risk that could happen in your project. The implementing risk response is following your plan, looking at who you've assigned to respond to the risk, looking at the risk response, and then when those risks start happening, you already have a plan, right? The whole idea of risk management is that you are doing it proactively. And what does that mean? It means that before the project starts, you've already identified areas where risk can happen, and you already have responses ahead. That's a good plan. And so we're just implementing it. Then the last process is monitoring risk. And this is a very powerful process. And the reason why I'm saying it's powerful is because risk can come at any time in the project, right? And so effective risk monitoring ensures that we can easily adjust our strategies to respond to risk, especially when the risk changes in nature or we discover new risk. And I use the example of COVID. Now, every government, right, whether in collaboration with other governments or whether, handling it solo, they were all doing risk monitoring. How do you know they were doing risk monitoring? Because they were changing their strategies. So that's my proof. At one point, when it was getting really bad, the strategy was everybody stay at home, right? Only essential services could move. After some time, they looked at the data and it seemed as if they had a little bit of control. Then they now said, okay, people, you guys can go out, but social distancing, and there are a lot of strict rules. Then after some time, how they could do that was someone was monitoring the risk. They were also identifying new risk. New variants of COVID came up. They came up with risk responsive vaccines, injection, and so on. And I think that for this process, monitoring risk, COVID is the best example I can give you because everybody saw all their countermeasures, all the risk response. That's what monitor risk is all about, right? You don't just go and sleep because you have a plan, risk plan. You have to keep on monitoring your risk register, looking at changes in risk. A risk can be ranked high, tomorrow is low, or a risk that was low is now ranked high. And that's why you need to monitor risk because things do not stay static in a project. That's risk. If I'm going to give a 5-minute, 10-minute summary, that is it. And risk monitoring is done till you finish the project. And that is risk management. So I've just encouraged you to go and watch yesterday's video because I've just done a summary. So let's move on to procurement planning. If you still have questions about yesterday's video, please ask me. And if you don't, right, it's fine. I've given a summary, so just note it. Now, procurement management. What does this mean? Now, at some point in your project, depending on the size of your project, you might need vendors or suppliers or people from outside your project. And that is where procurement comes in, especially when you're buying materials or you need a third party to come and do some work. Maybe it's not your core area of expertise. You need to go into procurement. Now, procurement is that knowledge area where we think of contracts. It's that knowledge area where we think of, you know, strategies. And why do we need contracts? Because we have to work under agreement to ensure that the work is delivered, right, according to what was agreed. You know, the good book says, can two work together unless they agree, right? So if we are going to work together, we must have a contract. We must have something we both agree to. And we start the knowledge area, plan procurement, with a plan. And the goal of that plan is to guide us on how to select the best vendor that we can. That's the goal of procurement planning. How are we going to select the best vendor? How do we select? You know why? If you choose the wrong vendor, it's going to cost you a lot more than you're paying that vendor. Because if the vendor messes up the job, it's going to cost you way more than you bargained for. Way more than you bargained for. So that's the reason why we do procurement planning. Another reason why we need procurement planning is that sometimes we may actually have the capacity to do the work, but it's possible that we have other priorities. Let me explain what I'm saying. So let's say you are in the maybe you offer services to companies or you build things for them, right? And you have maybe 3 or 4 projects you're handling for clients. And then you get this huge contract from federal government, huge, massive. And the worth and value of the contract is worth all your current contracts by at least 50 times. Now, sometimes it doesn't pay you to to commit all your resources on those contracts if you have one that is far more value, right? You may decide to outsource some of those ones and then move your team to concentrate on the big one. So sometimes we have to do what we call a make or buy analysis. A make or buy analysis is where we ask ourselves, do we outsource this one or do we do it ourselves? Now, in make or buy analysis, sometimes you don't have a choice in the sense that you don't even have the skills to do the work. But it's still a question we ask while planning procurement. Do we outsource or not? And we're going to look at how make or buy analysis works. So in planning procurement, we have the inputs, of course, the project charter, which is the high level description of the project, the business case justification, why the project is being done, and the benefits management plan shows how benefits will be realized in the project. Now, the scope management plan shows how scope is going to be developed and managed. and how it will be controlled throughout the project. The quality management plan shows us the quality standards, and this is particularly important when you are selecting your vendor. Your vendor must be able to match the quality standards um, being advertised in your project. Then the resource management plan shows how we identify, estimate, acquire resources. Some of the resources you're going to acquire are material, so that can lead us to procurement. And the scope baseline shows us the overall scope of the project, the work breakdown structure, the WBS, the scope statement, everything you need to know about the scope is in the scope baseline, right? Then the milestone list. This is very important to procurement because your vendors have to match your milestones. You don't want to hire a vendor that they are now dragging the project back. Your vendors must be able to match up with your milestones. And if they are not able to, then you have to negotiate on the milestones. Then requirements documentation. Your project team assignment shows the people that have been assigned to various areas of your project, assignment, task, and so on. Requirements documentation. This can actually mean that for that work, you might need a particular license and a vendor that has that license to do the work. So if one of your requirements involve your vendor having license, it will be part of the requirements document as well. Requirements traceability matrix shows all the requirements that should be, achieved in the project and also how they'll be tested. Then resource requirements. These are the people, material, and equipment that we need to get. Materials and equipment can be procured. Risk register, we look at risks that can impact procurement in the risk register. Stakeholder register, we look at stakeholders that are involved in procurement, and we have enterprise environmental factors and organization process assets. One of the things we look at in organization process assets is what we call the types of contracts that your organization normally engages in, like fixed price contracts, cost reimbursable contracts. We'll talk about contract types. So the types of contracts, and it could also, your organization process assets could also have the pre-qualified vendors that are registered with the organization. For some organizations, they pre-qualify their vendors, which means they have registered vendors. Anytime they want to get work done, they go through their pre-qualified vendors. So expert judgment, an expert in procurement and also in legal. Expert judgment is anybody, individual or group that has understanding of the regulatory and legal framework can provide expert judgment in procurement planning. For example, if you go into the oil and gas, you can't just do procurement anyhow. You have to understand the regulatory framework in procurement, the licenses you need, the rules of the game. Then, if you're planning procurement, what do? You do market research. What is market research? Market research is where we look at we research potential vendors. Think about this. Everybody here, well, most of us wanted to take PMP and you did research. You asked a friend or you browsed online or, you did some form of research. That's exactly what you do when you want to go into procurement, you do market research. Which companies are able to provide this service for me? So you do your elementary research to find the possible vendors that can do the work for you, right? And then your make or buy analysis. Remember, I said make or buy analysis. So this is where we ask ourselves, should we do this work ourselves or should we outsource it? Now, in the next slide, we're going to talk about make or buy analysis and how to choose between make or buy. Then source selection analysis. So when we talk about source selection analysis, this is where we decide how we're going to choose our vendor. So there are about 4 or 5. Number 1 is lowest cost, either lowest cost or lowest price, right? Lowest cost. Now, what does lowest cost mean? It means that we're going to choose the vendor that is the cheapest. Now, this is not always the best strategy. Some people feel that the cheapest vendor is always the best. Not necessarily. Now, if the job you want to outsource is something common and routine, which means it's a simple job and has a low degree of customization, right? Which means it's not technical. It's just like you want to build a table, right, for your kids' room, right? You just need a nice table. Now, if you interview 6, 7, or 8 carpenters, it's okay to go for the one with the lowest cost or lowest price because the average carpenter can build a table. So you can go for the lowest cost. But if that project, sorry, sorry, I forgot to put my phone on the side. If that project is if that project is complex and you choose lowest cost, they are going to choose the wrong vendor most times because everybody wants contract, especially when they don't understand the job. They'll give you a price to them is high, but regarding the work, it's low. So you only choose lowest cost when you're dealing with projects with a routine nature. It's not complex. Choose the lowest vendor. Then another source selection we're going to talk about is qualifications only. Qualifications only, it means that we're only going to talk to qualified vendors. Now, when we talk about qualifications only, imagine that your organization is buying new laptops and they want to install the latest Windows. They are not going to go to Computer Village and, just meet a guy that can install all sorts of softwares, cracked versions, of course. No company would do that, right? They will just, where only this contract is for Microsoft license partners. That's qualifications only. So that could be another source that look, we're not going to talk to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. We're just going to talk to the qualified people that have licenses to do the job, qualifications only. Another selection analysis is quality based highest technical proposal score. Now, I summarized it to 8 TPS, quality-based highest technical proposal score. Now, for quality-based highest technical proposal score, you are going to have a scoring system that you are going to use to evaluate every vendor. And that scoring system is called source selection criteria. It's an output, source selection criteria. Now, source selection criteria will stipulate what you are going to score. So, for example, you can score vendors on the number of years of experience they've had in a particular field. So let's say you have 3 vendors. One has had 3 years experience, one has had 7, one has had maybe 10. And your scoring is any company that has had 8 years, you give them the full 10 over 10. The one that has 7, you give them maybe 7 over 10, and the one that has 3, you give them 5. So you must create a scoring system because you are going to choose the highest, the company that ranks the highest in terms of quality. That means you're going to set different criteria, things like number of years of warranty they're guaranteeing. You can even score their managerial. This is why sometimes some companies must have certain, they look at their management board to see the kind of skills they have. It's also there. So quality-based highest technical proposal score is another one. Then we have quality and cost base. Quality and cost base is saying that, yes, we're looking at quality, we're also looking at cost. So we want to balance out the two. So in this kind of contract, you're going to submit your technical bid and your commercial bid, and they'll make decision based on two, not just on quality alone. Then number 5, we have what we call fixed price contracts. Fixed price contract means that you're going to fix the price and nobody can negotiate it. And, that's one. Then last one is sole source. Sole source means that contract is going to one vendor, and that's because there's only one vendor that can do the work. Like in Nigeria, PHCN is the only company, right, that can give you electricity from the national grid. So there's no other company to compete against them. It's sole source procurement. So these are the 6, I think 6, right? 6 so source selection analysis that helps you to choose from the vendors, right? So at the end of the day, we're going to create a procurement management plan, which will include the procurement activities. It will also include how those procurement activities works with the project schedule. It will include if you're going to use performance bonds and insurance contracts for large-scale projects, performance bonds and insurance contracts can be used. The procurement management plan will also include the procurement objectives, and it will also include whether you're going to use independent cost estimates or not. So it has quite a number of functions. Let me explain independent cost estimates and performance bonds and insurance contracts. Let me start with performance bonds. So when you're working on large projects that involves a lot of money, billions, most, especially one that comes from government, you might be required to provide a performance bond. I mean, yes. Now, there was a project we were bidding for some time ago, and they asked us to provide something like that. And that's the first time I actually heard about it. Now, the reason they use that is that the project is worth billions, right? The project is worth billions, right? And you don't want to give a company billions of dollars only to find out that the MD and some other staff have relocated to another country. So the bank steps in and they become a middleman between the the client and the vendor. And based and the bank will ask um, the bank will ask the vendor to provide collateral worth the sum. I'm trying to remember the name. Advanced, I think it's called an advanced payment guarantee or something like that. And so the bank will do project management for the client and pay the client based on the milestone. So it's as if the client gives the money to the bank asks for collateral worth the value of the project. I think that's called advance payment guarantee or something like that. And then the bank sends project managers to oversee the project and pay the vendor based on milestone. That is performance bond. Insurance contract is the same thing, but this time around is an insurance company that is going to be doing what the bank is doing. And that is that. Do we have anybody that has any experience with this? Maybe you could just chip in. Maybe you've had experience with performance bonds, insurance contract. I've in one or two of my classes, we've had people with such experience. Anybody? Anybody at all? Performance bonds, insurance contract. Anybody? Yep. Anybody? Okay, no worries, no worries. Um, yes. Now, another thing is procurement strategy. So when we talk about procurement strategy, we're talking about how to engage the vendor, right? So when it comes to procurement strategy, the notable ones is instead of outsourcing to the vendor, you can partner in a joint venture or partnership. You know, ideally, I pay a contractor to do work for me. But if I choose to partner with the contractor uses resources, I also do my part and then we split the profit. So it's a strategy, right? It's a procurement strategy so that instead of paying the vendor, you partner with the vendor and you share the profit. And of course, in Nigeria, NMPC does that with all the major IOCs, right? Joint venture is a procurement strategy. Another example, notable example, there are about 6 or 7 in the PMO. I don't think you need to palm all of them. This is called, of course, you have your turnkey project there. Then you have what we call BOOT. BOOT. What does BOOT mean? Build, own, operate, transfer. A good example, I'll give you 2 good examples in Nigeria. Sorry, I haven't traveled far enough to give you, but I'm sure if I do research, I'll probably get more. So one of them is MMA2, right? MMA2 and the Lekki. Now, what's BOOT? BOT is a private company will come and build infrastructure mainly for government, but it doesn't have to be for government. Now, one of the infrastructure is the airport. MMA2 is an airport besides our local airport in Nigeria, in Lagos, right? In Lagos, MMA2 was built by Courtney under a build, own, operate, transfer arrangement. So by Courtney built it, they owned it for 15 years, they operated it to make their money back, and they transferred it back to government. So I think it's back in the hands of government. The Lekki-Ajah Expressway used to have toll. Why? Because it was under build, own, operate, transfer. So a number of banks financed this Lekki-Ajah Express Road. So they built it. I don't know who owned it. They operated the tolls, and they are meant to transfer back to government. So those are examples of BOT project. It's a procurement strategy. So you can come up with different procurement strategies under procurement strategy. Another one procurement strategy I've seen, though not listed in the PMBOK, is multi-sourcing. And what is multi-sourcing? You give several vendors different parts of your contract. A good example is the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, where one part was outsourced to Julius Berger, another part was outsourced to RCC. That's also a procurement strategy, right? Now, bid documents. When you're getting ready for procurement, you're going to create bid documents. What are bid documents? Request for proposal, request. These are documents you send to potential vendors, asking them to submit a bid. Request for proposal, request for information, request for quotation, and invitation for bid. Now, procurement statement of work is the description of the work that the vendor is going to do. In fact, these two come together because if you're asking a vendor to submit a bid for work, what? The bid for the statement of work. So the statement of work is the more or less the scope of work that has been itemized that the vendor must achieve. And this scope of work, right, is actually drawn from the scope baseline, right? It's drawn from the scope baseline. Why? Because the scope baseline, the contract is actually part of the project scope, right? But a portion of the project scope that is going to be outsourced. So the scope baseline serves as terms of reference, which means if the vendor wants to have more information, how their work fits into the full scope of project, they can use the scope baseline as a terms of reference. Now, another thing that we talked about is the source selection criteria. Source selection criteria. So what's source selection criteria? This is the selection under quality-based highest technical proposal score, where you come up with criteria to score the vendors, right? So there must be a scoring system based on different criteria. So in terms of number of years of experience, that's one criteria, score them. In terms of number of years of warranty, score them. In terms of managerial competence, you score them. In terms of financial capability, you score them. So it becomes a scoring system, just like in Canada. If you want to relocate to Canada, they use a point-based system to select. That's similar to the source selection criteria. It's based on points. Now, make or buy decision flows from make or buy analysis. So when we do our make or buy analysis, we make our decision. Now, if we choose to make means that we're going to do our work internally, then you stop this entire procurement process. Because if you choose to make, then you're not getting vendors, you're doing it yourself. If we choose to buy, then we continue to the other processes till we select the vendors that are going to do the work. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is independent cost estimates. Now, you know that I don't talk about everything because it's just a lot. But I try to give you enough information to see the full picture and to be able to answer questions, right? So I just stop at some point. Otherwise, you probably need another 2, 3 weeks. So independent cost estimates is the last one I'm going to talk about. And independent cost estimate is where you hire a consultant to cost the work you want to outsource. That's what independent cost estimates are. You hire a consultant to cost the work you want to outsource, which means that person has many years of experience, or and it could be a company, right? Now, independent cost estimate does not mean that your team has not costed the work, but you just need a third opinion. Most times, independent cost estimates are used in negotiation, which means they're used in benchmarking and negotiation. If a company is bidding below the independent cost estimate, they are not going to get a contract, which means that bidding too low sometimes is a problem. Because if the independent cost estimate, without any bias, has said that to do this work, this is the amount, including profit, that is reasonable, and then you're bidding below that, the question is, how are you going to do the work when experts have said you can't do it below this price? So it becomes a benchmark for negotiations and for shortlisting, right? There's a particular time I was talking about independent cost estimate, and a construction company, and someone in the class talked about their church wanting to build a cathedral. Now, if you can picture a cathedral, it has very, it has a very elite design. It's not any construction company that can do it. A cathedral has some, I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. And the company bidded way below the price. They gave them the job. And guess what? They spent times 5 of what the company billed them because they kept on making corrections, you understand? So sometimes make sure you choose the right vendor with the right cost, right? And don't always try to look for the cheap one. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So independent cost estimate is what we are saying, okay? All right, so let's look at make or buy decision analysis, and I think we can go for a break. So when we're talking about make or buy analysis, what influences a make decision? What's a make decision? Do it yourself. When the buyer owns intellectual property associated with the work and considers doing the work internally in order to maintain control of the information. If you're an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, you don't want to release your intellectual property, because the moment a contractor has your secret of how you do your things, they can actually improve on it and leave you out of business. This is why Coca-Cola will never do anything that involves sharing their unique formula for making Coke. The moment all of us know how to make Coke, Coca-Cola has no business. If we know how to make it in our house. Anyway, some of us have almost quit drinking Coke. All right. So the reason I said almost wait, I drank one today and I'm feeling guilty. So, so if the buyer owns intellectual property, do it yourself. Now, do you know that um, do you know that iPhone, Apple took Samsung to court over Samsung creating their phones? Now, what happened was that Apple, Samsung made a particular chip for iPhone, and they were the lowest cost, right? And so Apple had to release the blueprint of the iPhone to Samsung, and Samsung was making their particular chip for the phone. All of a sudden, Samsung started making their own phones, and this is why if you look at the phone industry, right? If you don't buy an iPhone, probably the next best thing is a Samsung. And the reason is because Samsung used to be a vendor of Apple, and Apple accused them of using their blueprint to create their product. And they finally settled out of court with about $2 billion. Right. So if you have intellectual property, do your work yourself. Don't expose your trade secret. And guess what? The same thing happened with Nokia and Apple. Exactly the same thing. Nokia asked Apple to create a chip for them, and Apple started their own, and Nokia took them to court. Exactly the same thing. So we have to protect our intellectual property. Now, we choose make decision when the buyer has excessive qualified capacity. When the buyer has excessive qualified capacity, we do the work ourselves. The buyer has the capacity needed, right? So in Nigeria, there's hardly any project that Julius Berger cannot handle. They don't need to outsource work to a large extent, or Kappa. Kappa is also into Kappa. Kappa da Beto, I think that's the name. Construction, they do large scale construction projects. So if you have enough capacity, you don't need to outsource. Now, when do you make buy decision? When the buyer doesn't possess skills. Now, the buyer is the company that is, doing the work, that wants to outsource. If the buyer, the company doesn't have the skills, they don't have the skills, they can't do the work, you're forced to outsource. Or the buyer doesn't possess the capacity to do the work. They have the skills, but not the capacity. They have to outsource part of the work. So that is make or buy decision analysis. And all right, so let's look at this question and then we'll go for a break. Yeah, the project manager for a housing developer. The development requires a skid loader to clean out the lots where the houses will be built. The skid loader is available to rent at $100 per day, or it can be purchased for $5,000 and $50 a day for maintenance. What is the maximum time you would want to rent this tool before considering purchasing it? Now, you just need a simple formula. How much does it cost to rent a day? 100x. How much does it cost to buy? 5,000 plus $50 a day maintenance, 50x, 5,000 plus 50x, and renting is 100x. So to answer the question, what is the maximum time you would want to rent this to before considering buying it? We just have to equate when the cost of renting is equal to the cost of buying. And when we equate and solve for X, then we get our answer. So in the next slide, you see it. The cost of renting is 100x. The cost for buying is 5,000 plus 50x, software X. And in 100 days, it will cost the cost of renting and cost of buying will be exactly the same. 100 times 100 is 10,000. 100 times 550 is 5,000 plus 5,000 is 10,000. So in 100 days, the cost of renting the tool and buying it would have been the same. So what do? If you're going to use this tool for 100 days or more, then you should buy it. If you're going to rent this tool for less than 100 days, maybe 60 days, then just rent it. That's it. Okay, I think we deserve a break. We deserve a break, right? So let's take a 10-minute break. I'll pull up the countdown video and then we'll come back in exactly 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Let's see you in 10 minutes time. Yeah. About contracts. So a contract is mutually binding legal agreement between buyer and seller. Now, in procurement, we are engaging work with vendors and there must be some form of agreement. So other names for a contract could be a memorandum of understanding, a memorandum of agreement, service level agreement, or even agreement. Now let's look at what makes up a contract. There are 5 components that make up a contract. One of them is called capacity. And what does capacity mean? It's talking about the capacity of people that can enter into a contract. So competency is one of the things that determines capacity. Minors cannot enter into a contract. Minors cannot enter into a contract. That's why minors cannot pay rent, right? They must have a guardian. If you remember Justin Bieber, right, or Michael Jackson, when they were young or younger, they could not sign their own contracts because they don't have the capacity to sign contracts. And individual legal entities have the capacity to enter a contract. Now, let me talk about competency. Competency means that the people entering the contract are competent upstairs to enter the contract. There are no loose screws upstairs. What do I mean by that? If you sign a contract, oh, no, not you, someone else signs a contract with another person that has mental health issues and is discovered in the court of law that at the time they signed that contract with you, with that person, that they had mental health issues, they will nullify the contract because that person does not have the competency to sign contracts, to enter into an agreement. And that's what we're saying. Now, for minors, it is very understandable. I learned something in the last 3 months that, makes me support this. They said that the brain of a human being matures, fully develops at the age of 25. So some people don't know what they are doing before that age. So that's understandable. But competency is talking about that the 2 people or more people going into the contract have the competency upstairs, no mental health issues. And this is why, if you watch movies, if someone is creating, maybe they want to do their will and they want to document it on video, they normally say some phrases. I, blah, 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 blah. They'll say their name. In my right mind and senses. They say that. because they are saying, I'm not crazy. I know what I want, right? And that's competency. So the parties that engage in the contract must have competency to do so. Consideration is the item to change possession from seller to buyer. The offer is a proposition to exchange something for something. The reason for the contract has to be for something legal. Acceptance is a buyer willing to accept the offer from the seller. So without acceptance, there's no contract. In fact, without any of these components, there's no contract. And we have a lovely memory tool. It's called CCOLA, Capacity, Consideration, Offer, Legal, Acceptance. And if you remember Coca-Cola, you cannot forget. Though you might not get questions in this area, but it's good knowledge to have, right? So let's move on and talk about various terms for buyer and seller. Various terms for buyer and seller. So when we talk about buyer, we're going to be talking about buyer and seller very often in this knowledge area. What do we mean by buyer? So the buyer could be the client, the customer, the prime contractor. The buyer can even be a contractor buying services from another contractor, acquiring organization, government agency, service requester, and purchaser. Now, I tricked my mind into understanding buyer. So anytime I wanted to remember who the buyer was, in my mind, I would say buyer is the prime contractor who awards contract to a subcontractor. In other words, someone is giving contract to someone else. And it could also be a client, but this is my own hack. I just say the buyer is a prime contractor, someone who is giving contract to a subcontractor. Now, other names for seller could be a contractor, a subcontractor, a vendor, a service provider, supplier. Yes, that's where it stops. Supplier, right? So these are different names. The buyer is the client, the person that offers the contract to the seller. The seller is the person that executes the contract for money or for exchange of money or goods. Let's move on. Now we're going to talk about contract types because contract is the bond between client and vendor. But there are different types of contract types. We have what we call purchase order. We have what we call time and materials contract type. We have what we call fixed price contracts, and we have what we call cost reimbursable contracts. So let's look at all the contract types. So the first one is purchase order. The purchase order is a unilateral agreement that requires approval by only one party because the other party has offered the product for the predefined price. A purchase order is your organization asking another organization to supply some commodity items at a predefined price. In other words, a purchase order comes after a request for quotation. And in a purchase order, no party is under pressure. Why? Because it's left for the buyer to buy at a certain price, and it's left for the seller to decide to sell at a certain price. So nobody's under pressure. There's really no risk between buyer and seller. Now, let's go to fixed price contracts. Fixed price contracts are also known as lump sum contracts. And it is one of the most common contracts used in business today. And it is popular because a company can fix the price of their contract ahead. And the reason the company can fix a price is because they have details about the scope of work, right? So if you have enough details about the work that your vendor is going to do, then you can fix the price. Let me give an example of what I mean by detail. So let's say that you have this furniture magazine and you can see some very lovely furniture there. So maybe you like having furniture in your house, and then you see a particular executive table. In that magazine, they put all the dimensions of the piece of the wood. They've they've put the price of all the types of wood you're going to need to build that executive table, locations where you can get those materials, even the cost of nail, right? And when you estimated it, it's like 60,000. Now, because you have details of how much that table, that type of table will cost, if a carpenter comes and meets you, you know you are armed with information, you have that effrontery to fix the price because you have a lot of details about the scope of work. So the carpenter can just come and say, this table is going to cost you 120,000. And then you just say, look, I can only do it for 80,000. I said, no, 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 no. Then you ask him, how much is wood? And it would not 15,000 per length. And it's surprised that you have all these details. So using a fixed price contract comes when you have a lot of information about the contract to be awarded. So much information that you can estimate it yourself. So if that's the case, you go with fixed price contract. And fixed price contract means that the buyer fixes the price of the contract. And let me tell you, if you go for a negotiation and you just realize that the client is not budging from a price, that contract is a fixed price contract. They fixed it. There's nothing you do. Now, the risk for the buyer is minimal. Why is it minimal? It is the buyer that determines the fixed price. It is the buyer that determines the fixed price. So the buyer is not under pressure. They call the shots. If the seller accepts a fixed price contract and they don't do costing properly, sometimes there might be hidden cost. The seller can make a loss in this contract. Because if there are hidden costs, and how do they make a loss? Because they've signed fixed price. Fixed price contract means that you can't go back to the vendor and say to the client and say, I'm sorry, as some vendors do. I'm sorry we did not account for this. That is your cup of tea that you will drink with ice block. A lot of companies don't like fixed price, especially if you're the seller, right? Unless you really know that work and you're sure you get your profit. And so it's a high risk for vendors. Now we have another variation of fixed price. It's called fixed price incentive fee. And what does fixed price incentive fee mean? Fixed price incentive fee means that the buyer is going to fix the price for the seller, but also adds an incentive to motivate the seller to work faster. So the buyer decides both the fixed price and the incentive fee. Now, let me paint a scenario. Let's imagine that your car has an issue and you have a family function over the weekend, right? So let's say you discover the issue on Wednesday and you want to take that car to the family function on Saturday. And your mechanic is saying it's going to take 4 to 5 days. Now, adding an incentive, you could tell him that, okay, look, if you can do it, complete the car by Friday, I'll give you an extra 5,000 naira. That's what we mean by incentive fee. You are providing an incentive for the vendor to work faster. Let's look at this example. A city buying services from a construction company to put in a new highway for $4 million. So what's the $4 million? The fixed price. For each week the seller finishes before a given date, it receives $65,000 extra. So let's say that the due date is December 1st and they finish November 1st, and that's roughly 4 weeks. So that means that the vendor not only gets 4 million, but gets 4 million plus 4 times 65,000, which is 260,000, because they were able to beat the deadline by 4 weeks. So fixed price incentive fee, the risk for the buyer is minimal because the buyer determines both the fixed price and incentive fee. The risk for the seller is significant. Why is it significant? Because in trying to rush in a project, you can make more mistakes. So the risk is still significant. Now let's talk about fixed price economic price adjustment, which is FEPA, FPEPA, right? Now, this kind of contract is used for multi-year projects. All right, go ahead, Faith. Faith has a question. Yeah.
Yes, I do have a question. So if incentive is offered, like in the example that you gave of a city buying services from a construction company and offering incentive for the week that they finish on time, isn't a project, for instance, supposed to have like a schedule or a timeline for when they finish? So if incentive is being offered, or if the project is finishing because of the incentive that is being offered, does it now mean that they are not following that schedule that they have created? Are they rushing up the work? Isn't there going to be mistakes or issues that may come up as a result of rushing the work? I'm just wondering how that is possible. I do know that they could hire additional resources, but is that what the incentive will not cover? I'm just wondering.
It's a good question. So, how do we speed up projects? Now, in when we were in schedule management, we talked about crashing and fast tracking, which means as a project manager, if you wanted to speed up your project, there are actually techniques that helps you to do that. Fast tracking means that we're doing several work simultaneously. Crashing means we're adding more resources, just like you said. But even beyond that, what is a schedule? A schedule is a plan. And when we're creating plans, we normally put buffers. We put, so if something is going to take 3 days, you might put 4 days. Now, if a project manager manages their schedule efficiently, it is possible to finish ahead of schedule by taking advantage of opportunities to save time, managing resources efficiently, ensuring that there are few mistakes. So it doesn't mean that they're not following the schedule. It might actually mean they are managing the schedule very efficiently, that there are no delays in the project, right? So it doesn't mean they're not following the schedule. It might mean that they're actually managing the schedule more efficiently than planned, because part of planning a schedule includes putting buffers. And if we don't need the buffers, the project is going to finish ahead of schedule. Yeah, I hope I answered your question, Faye.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Yes, 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 that's it. So fixed price economic price adjustment, FPEPA, is used for multi-year contracts that span multiple years. And what happens in a fixed price economic price adjustment is that the fixed price will be adjusted every year according to an economic metric, right? The fixed price will be adjusted every year according to an economic metric. It could be standard of living, exchange rate. Let's look at the example here. A city buys services from a construction company to build a new highway for $4 million over 3 years. Sorry, I didn't read that one. A city buys services from a construction company to build a new highway or freeway for $4 million over 3 years. So you can see it's over 3 years, right? At the start of each year, the amount varies relative to the national cost of living or some other negotiated standard. Now let's look at the risk. The risk for the buyer is minimal, right? The risk for the buyer, is minimal because the buyer determines both the fixed price and the economic price adjustment. The risk for the seller is significant because sometimes these things cannot be predictable, and that is fixed price economic price adjustment. In other words, fixed price has three variations: the fixed price or lump sum, the fixed price incentive fee, the fixed price economic price adjustment. Let's go over to time and material contract type. Time and materials is used for staff supplementation. Is used for staff supplementation. And how does it work? It is you pay for the time that the staff or the contract staff will be working, and the materials, you pay for it. So it's used for smaller initiatives where you need staff supplementation, right? And that's simply it. The risk for the buyer is minimal and the risk for the seller is minimal, right? So if you need more staff, use time and materials contract type. So let's talk about cost plus fixed fee. This is the last set of contract types. We call them cost reimbursable, which means you reimburse the seller for doing the work. Now, this is used when the buyer knows generally what is needed but lacks detail. Now, you can see that this type of contract is conflicting or in direct opposite with fixed price, because in fixed price, the buyer has details of the scope of work. Here, you have an idea, but you don't have the details, which means the buyer cannot fix the price. So, under the cost plus fixed price, it covers the cost of the seller and includes a predefined fee for the work, which means the cost plus fixed fee is that the buyer will pay for the cost of the work and include the fixed fee, which is the seller's guaranteed profit. Which means the seller cannot make a loss in cost plus fixed fee. Why? You're going to cover the cost of doing the work, number one, then the fixed fee, right? And picture you going to the mechanic, and then the mechanic is going to break down the cost of everything. So the cost of brake pad is this, the cost of this is that, the cost of that is that, the cut off. And then they'll now end up by saying workmanship. What's workmanship? Fixed fee that cannot be, you can't even, that one, you can't touch it. It is constant. Then they come up with their fixed fee. right? And that's what we're saying. So unlike fixed price contracts, in cost reimbursable, the seller's profit is guaranteed. In fixed price contract, the seller's profit is dependent rather on how much they can save. Here, they don't have to save anything. Money is sure. Let's talk about cost plus incentive fee. So when we talk about cost plus incentive fee, this is where we look at, the risk for the buyer is medium, the risk for the seller is minimal. So what does cost plus incentive fee? So cost plus incentive fee means that you pay for the cost of the work, the buyer pays for the cost of the work, and also includes an incentive to make the seller work faster. So the buyer pays both the cost of the work and incentive, and the seller just gets everything. So no pressure on the seller. The buyer is concerned because he's concerned about the cost. The buyer doesn't have an idea of the cost, so he's concerned, and is also concerned about the incentive fee. But the seller does the work and enjoys everything. Now, this is the last one. We're going to talk about cost plus percentage of cost, or cost plus fee. Now, what does cost plus percentage of cost mean? It means that the buyer is going to pay for the cost of doing the work and is going to pay a percentage of that cost to the seller. So that means that so let's say that percentage of cost is 10%. So if a project costs $400 million, the seller gets 40 million, which means total project cost is $440 million. Now, let's look at the risk. Now, the risk for this buyer is now significant because now the buyer is very concerned about cost, because not only is he concerned about the project cost, he's also concerned about the incentive. But the seller cannot be more happier than this, because of course they are going to get a percentage, and that is their take-home pay. Now, many companies will not go for this type of contract. Why? Because if the seller is unethical, is going to find out ways to increase the cost of the project, because the higher the project cost, the more money they take home. So imagine a seller that is going to look for the most expensive material only so that they can get more money, right? And so a lot of companies run away from this type of contract. Okay, fantastic. Let's move on. So discussed under cost plus incentive fee is something we call a share. So a share is a type of incentive, right? It's discussed under cost plus incentive fee in the PM Book 6th edition. And so it's a type of incentive fee, but the way this works is that so let's say that the contract project price is this amount, right? And the vendor is able to save money. The money saved is going to be shared according to a negotiated rate. This is what we call share. So the 5,000, then the negotiated rate is that buyer will get 60% of what is saved, seller will get 40%. So seller gets 45,000 plus 2,000, which is their own share for helping the vendor to save money, helping the client to save money. That's a shared strategy. So let's talk about let's talk about procurement documents. Right now, there are four types of procurement documents. We have request for quotation. Request for quotation is used when you want a company to submit their quotation for some products you want them to supply, right? So request for quotation, right? Request for quotation is you asking vendors to submit quotation either for commodity items or a small project, right? You can ask them for quotation. Request for information is where you're asking vendors for information based on a project you are working on. Now, some companies do not honor requests for information. You know why? When you give them information, there's no guarantee that they will do the work. So request for information is actually just asking a company, look, we're trying to do this project. Can you give us some details on how to go about it? That's what request for information is. Now, if they now give you information, what's the guarantee that you're going to give them the job? So sometimes when it comes to request for information, it might not be honored, right? Let's look at another procurement document, request for proposal. Now, the request for proposal, sometimes called request for tender, right, is a document that requests for proposals from the vendors, including a detailed approach to the solution and previous experience, right? So vendors will submit their proposals. Invitation for bid is exactly the same thing as request for proposal. The only difference is that invitation for bid is used by government agencies. Private companies use request for proposal or request for tender, while government agencies use invitation for bid or request for bid. So in newspaper, the moment you see the title invitation for bid, just know it's a government agency. In newspapers, the moment you see request for proposal or request for tender, just know it's a private company that is requesting for the proposals, right? So let's move on. Let's move on. Okay, so that is that. That is that. Now let's talk about conduct procurement, because this is the process where we select vendors, we solicit seller responses, select vendors, and award contracts. So this is where we engage with vendors. And how do you know? Look at the outputs: selected sellers and contract agreement drafted. So there's going to be a lot of engagement between vendors, but let's look at the inputs. So in conducting procurement, you are going to look at the seller proposals. So sellers have started dropping their proposals, and your procurement documentation are part of the plans that you've already created. Your procurement documentation includes your procurement statement of work, procurement statement of work, SOW, your bid document, your independent estimate. And one more. So that means you already have some of the documents you're going to use to evaluate and then probably your source selection criteria that will be used to choose between vendors. So you have some procurement documentation that will assist you in selecting the vendors, right, as well. Now, another thing that's very important in the input is communication planning. And why is communication planning important? It's important because we have to, plan how vendors are going to reach us. Are you going to provide them a number, an email address, or a link where they can send messages to us? It's very important in procurement. Something that's also important is cost baseline. Cost baseline is the project sum. You cannot award contract above your budget. So it's also there. Then project schedule is also important because we have to ensure the vendor comes in line with our project schedule. And then they also know all the requirements of the project. Now, we also look at risk relating to the project. Now, some of project risk will be outsourced. Remember, risk response to negative risk, avoid transfer, mitigate. Transfer means you are outsourcing that part of your project because of risk. So there are some things we are going to outsource because of risk. Now, expert judgment. When we talk about expert judgment, this is where our expert in terms of procurement, in terms of legal judgment comes in selecting vendors. Advertising is done when, let's say that the crop of vendors that are bidding for your job, they're not interesting. You can keep advertising to get more responses. A bidders conference is where all your vendors meet with the buyer. There's a disadvantage to bidders conference, but there's also an advantage. Now, bidders conference is used when you are dealing with a very complex project, and it allows sellers to ask the buyer or buyer's question. Now, what's the disadvantage? Most bidding, when a company wants to get a vendor, they normally have private sessions with different companies and get their, they get their bids, right? But in a bidders conference, the vendors see themselves, and so they can gang up against the buyer and say, look, there's no need for us to compete. Let's just give this guy the job, and then he will settle all of us. So that's the disadvantage of bidders conference, where your vendors can, like, come on, see themselves, know each other, and then they can try to outsmart the buyer. Proposal evaluation. Now, proposal evaluation is where we check the completeness of the proposal document. When I mentioned a document, bid document, request for proposal. Now, in a request for proposal, there'll be certain specification of what the vendor must submit. We need to evaluate the completeness of their submission. Otherwise, we will disqualify them. Right? So proposal evaluation and then negotiation is done. Once we have negotiated and we are happy with the vendors, we select the vendors and we create contracts. And that is what conduct procurement is. It's a process of engaging vendors, negotiating, and then come up with standard terms and conditions. So let me just explain this and we'll call it a day. Right. I actually mentioned it earlier, so I can easily explain it. Now, if you look at conduct procurement process, you notice that conduct procurement, if you look at seller proposals, means that a lot of people are submitting proposals for probably one job. It means that conduct procurement process is naturally a competitive form of procurement. But there are some contracts that are non-competitive. And I mentioned this earlier, sole source. So when there's sole source procurement, there's only one company that can do the job. Like Pete said, no other company can connect you to the grid. So anytime you have project towards that area, there's no need to do procurement planning. Just find out their terms and engage. They are the only companies that can do the job. But when it comes to single source, it's a bit different. Single source procurement happens when you don't have time to go through the lengthy negotiation process. You don't have time to go through the lengthy negotiation process. So you just choose a vendor on the go. Single source can also happen where you just prefer to work with a vendor. Their work is so sound that you don't have any reason to change the vendor. And that is single source. Now, some companies have policies against single source, right? Because sometimes it might look like it's not fair. But anyway, life is not fair. So that is where we're going to stop. So again, thank you guys for joining today's class. From my estimation, we have 2 or 3 days left. So let's just peg it Wednesday next week. If it can be Tuesday, I'll be happy as well, because we're actually meant to start a class next week. Now, if you've enjoyed the course so far, please tell your friends so that they can close out the year with us, and we will be very happy you did so. Again, no class tomorrow. Enjoy your weekend and see you on Monday by God's grace. Good night, good afternoon, and God bless.